All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Michelle Minton, a senior policy analyst at the Reason Foundation. Welcome to Free the Economy, Michelle.
Thank you for having me on, Richard.
Now, let's start with what you do and how it's different from a lot of the other people who do sort of research about public policy.
Right.
Now,
Go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say, like a lot of people, they're experts in things like defense, the federal budget, foreign affairs, things like that. But I think your portfolio is different and really interesting. And so I like the term lifestyle freedom.
hmm
Um, but how would you describe the issues that you like research and write about?
Yeah, lifestyle freedom is a great way to put it, since just in all the things that I cover, which includes, gambling, alcohol, food, nutrition, like food and nutrition, tobacco, drugs, and a little bit of sex work, in terms of the topics that I cover.
Mhm.
And so, I don't know if anybody likes it, but I have always kind of liked calling it in my head the vice policy. It's just the vice policy wheelhouse, because all of those things, including food, at some point or another get classified as immoral.
Right. And one of the I think probably one of the like the hottest topics from your body of work that people are probably going to be familiar with. I mean, a lot of us are familiar with all of those things, but that's been in the news is about vaping and the debate about cigarette smoking. Obviously, we've had cigarette smoking government policy on tobacco and cigarettes for decades. And vaping is the sort of relatively newer version of that. So the health impact, what government should or shouldn't be doing about all that, um, and to, discourage or encourage use of things like vapes. First, I guess the first question is like, what is the real state of like medical science in terms of like smoking versus vaping? And then what's the sort of state of play in terms of like public policy with what the government is doing?
Right. So, medical science has known since at least the 70s that the major harm from smoking, like the thing about smoking that causes the most damage to the body and is the greatest risk of disease, is combustion. So it's lighting the paper and tobacco on fire and then repeatedly breathing it in multiple times a day. And since that knowledge, since that awareness, medical scientists, including our own government, have sought ways to deliver nicotine to people who can or won't quit using it or don't want to. How we can give them a nicotine consumption method that would replace smoking without combustion. And, pharmaceutical companies have tried this in inhaler forms. Nobody really dug that. And then just the market itself, the free market itself, through trial and error over a period of a few years with a lot of help from consumers on chat boards and stuff, kind of comparing notes, came up with devices and nicotine liquids and a delivery method that was a really good replacement for smokers who wanted something less harmful. And the science is pretty clear, even in the last 15 years, even though that's still relatively new for a product. The evidence just keeps coming in more and more solid that while vaping nicotine through these devices may not be 100% risk free, because nothing in life is, they're vastly, vastly safer than, smoking a combustible tobacco product multiple times a day.
And so, but that has not stopped government authorities and public health officials from coming in and say, well, we don't like vaping either. Even, so to what extent do policymakers, whether it's, people here in the United States or, internationally or the World Health Organization, whoever, like to what extent do they acknowledge that vaping is much safer than smoking, but still say, but we still don't want anyone to vape either?
To very little degree. Few people within the public health establishment, and that's mostly internationally, will acknowledge in any kind of real way that non-combustible tobacco products or nicotine products are vastly safer than combustible products. And really what these products, not just e-cigarettes or vaping products, but there's heated tobacco, nicotine pouches, snus, these kind of things are inconvenient innovations for public health around tobacco, because the idea was always we're going to educate people about the risks, and that was great. And smoking just shot down from the 60s, and then it kind of plateaued for a while, even went up, and they're like, all right, we need to really scare people about this stuff. And if you lose the scary part of it, if you smoke, you get cancer. If you smoke, your teeth will rot, all this other stuff. When you take that out of the equation, this is just true. This is inconvenient for everybody, that when the risk is lowered and people know it's lowered, more people are going to engage in that activity, right? More people like me when I was a youngster was like, I would love to smoke, but I don't want to die. I would have been the one who would have been like, yeah, vaping at like 16, 17, 18, whatever. So you have people in public health who are trying to, well, not really trying, they say they're trying to square this balance. They're trying to balance out the benefits of, some will say that, yes, it's safer. And then they'll usually combine that with, but it's not safe enough, or it's still really risky, or it sets, youngsters on a path towards really harmful behaviors down the road, aka the gateway theory. So they say they're trying to balance concerns about people who are not smokers, not nicotine users, but who might be, against those who are currently using nicotine or tobacco in some form.
So, one big issue here that I feel like didn't get mentioned that often in like popular conversations until a few years ago was the reliability and honesty of public health officials themselves. So a lot of people used to, and plenty of people still do, tend to just sort of accept whatever statement comes out of a government health agency, basically at face value. Now, obviously, that changed for some people with the COVID era health policy, when it seemed, I'd say some of the decisions coming out of, say, the Centers for Disease Control, the National, Institutes for Health, or the White House Council, whatever, seemed to be being made for political reasons, ideological reasons, rather than simply 100%, scientifically based. What So what do you think about the public confidence in public health? Is it good that we have less confidence in public health officials because maybe we shouldn't have in the first place? Or like what do we need to know about the sort of professional institutional incentives of being in the world of public health that might affect, what they tell us?
Yeah, I mean, we keep saying the term public health, right? Like it's a very complicated topic depending on whether you talk about a state level public health institution, federal, international, that kind of thing. But like at the end of the day, most of these organizations are made up by lifetime, bureaucrats, or some of them not lifetime, but some are appointees, and a lot of them pick particular dogmas that they like to follow. And then the political appointees, obviously, the people at the top, if you're talking about like the FDA, CDC, those kind of things, they have political considerations, right? They have to answer to the president that appointed them and the party that, is breathing down their neck. So like there's a lot of different things they have to balance. Oh, I'm kind of getting a little bit lost in my thought there. What was your question again? Remind me.
Oh, just about the
Oh,
shifting confidence that some people have,
yeah.
like if you would ask the average person, like, oh, do you have confidence in federal public health officials, right? If you ask that question in like January of 2019, it would probably be pretty different from today, in part because there's so much controversy about COVID era health policy, and I think part of it, maybe I'll sort of lead into this for you, is that I feel like there was, and I think our my colleague here at CEI, Dr. Joel Zinberg, has written a lot about this. He's an MD, but he's also a policy expert, and so he's sort of got a really good insight into this. But I would say that there were certain sort of like statistical findings or things that were observable from the like medical literature, but then there were policies that were implemented based on those. But the policies we got weren't necessarily the only legitimate policies that could have been made given the underlying evidence, right? If we say, transmissibility of COVID is, on a 27 out of 100, say it's an imaginary scale, right? What does that mean? Does that mean you have to close schools or not? Well, the question of whether or not to close schools isn't really a scientific question. It's more a sort of like social impact question. But I think some officials sort of pretended that because they cited some scientific study, that their political and policy recommendations were above criticism.
Yeah, and I think you're right that the public confidence in public health, like in the CDC, and in the FDA, has been declining for years. And I remember writing a piece just a couple months before the pandemic really broke out, where I was warning the CDC specifically because this was the summer of 2019, and there was an outbreak of a weird, mysterious lung injury that was happening first among young people and among more. Started in Michigan or one of the Midwestern states and started to bleed out of the country. And the CDC started putting out, notifications and alerts about this e-cigarette related, disease that was happening. And they really played it up. And all of that's great, except they weren't telling people the most important fact about all of those cases of lung illness, which was that they were almost exclusively, when the people were admitting what they used, almost exclusively associated with illicit market cannabis products, THC vapes, that were bootlegged. And later we found out, well, many of us realized within a few months of that outbreak that it was vitamin E acetate, this weird like solvent you can add into THC vapes. But it took the CDC many more months to start even vaguely communicating this to the public, and with the phrase of like, most of the cases, but not all of them, most of the cases say that they were associated with THC. And I was warning the CDC that you are going to lose the public confidence when you need it most, as in like there's an outbreak of an infectious disease and you need people to take vaccines. And it was incredible that it became like prophetic within a few months of that happening. And you could see immediately people pulling back from this idea of a emergency approved vaccine because people had lost confidence in the CDC throughout the earlier parts of the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, all of this, and like you said, there's something good here, because I know me and a few other people have been talking about for years that there's something rotten in the field of public health, that they are not focusing on infectious diseases or really important things. They are kind of often expanding out their mandate, expanding their territory into policy issues, into political issues. Not that there isn't a role for CDC for something like, gun deaths, but should the CDC be the one dictating policy on this?
Yeah, that's interesting that there was that like such an interesting example. So, soon before COVID, right? With this, with the CDC saying, "Oh, well, this is a vaping thing." It's like, well, it wasn't really a vaping thing. It was a sort of very specific subset of that. But it was obviously convenient for public health officials who were trying to tell people that no one should vape in the first place. How convenient that you now have this thing that they can say, "Oh, well, this applies to everyone," not this sort of bizarre subset of a handful of people. Um, and but I think what's also interesting is the sort of, if you look at not just say the most recent past few years, but decades, we say, look at the recommendations that have been made, say at the federal level, for public health, something like nutrition. What is the record? And if the record's really good, then maybe we should trust them more. But but look at the evidence versus whatever scientific minded person always tells you to do in the first place. So I, of course, am immediately thinking of a great study you did on salt and sodium consumption in the diet. And this is a big one of these like really big things that a lot of people are concerned about. They're like, how do I, what kind of healthy diet should I eat? And they, most people aren't professional dietitians. So really they're looking for broad strokes recommendations like, should I eat more or less fat, more or less carbs, more or less salt, more or less sugar? What's the biggest thing? What's most important? And so for a long time, the federal government said, oh, salt, it'll kill you. It'll give you high blood pressure. It'll give you a heart attack. It's the worst thing. You need as little salt in your diet as possible. Oh, and by the way, the case is just rock solid. More salt in your diet's the worst thing possibly ever. What did you see when you looked into that?
Yeah, and I love to point this out that my former colleague Dan Compton is the one who started me down this 6-month trail of writing a damn near book about the sodium guidelines, because the question that he asked in an op-ed and he didn't provide an answer was, where did this number come from? Where did this 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day come from? And when I started looking and kept digging backwards and backwards to try and find the answer, I couldn't really. It seems to have just materialized among staffers in a committee, and it's not really based on what's good for the human body and what studies are showing, and more specifically, what studies show about making a recommendation like that to people, what that does, right? Like you say, we think salt's connected to hypertension, so we're going to recommend to the population that for concerns about hypertension, they keep their sodium intake below X numbers a day, below X milligrams a day. And what the literature seems to find is that for most people, adjusting your salt up or down intentionally isn't going to have any effect really on your blood pressure. And for a small subset of the population, if you adjust your sodium down, may be harmful. But then you have these big public health institutions that really dislike nuance. They don't like communicating nuanced ideas to the public for whatever those reasons are, whether they think we're too stupid or they're going to get confused, or they really want to push us in a certain direction, which I think a lot of people in public health, that is the underlying goal. Is why tell them anything else when we want everyone to do this one thing? And it's problematic because, look, science just works this way, and nutrition, P.S., is an extremely early science. It's like a pretty nascent science as it goes. Science evolves. recommendations should change based on evolving science. But when you have something like nutrition science, where it goes back and forth and back and forth, and our guidelines are doing that too, because they've made too specific of recommendations based on weak science, it really does start the public losing trust in those recommendations. Most people don't even look at that, the my plate or the pyramid, after a certain age.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the sort of like shifting, evolving nature of dietary recommendations from the government and from in some cases like nonprofit institutions that get government funding. Um, some people would say, "Oh, well, that just reflects our evolving understanding," and that's it's good. It's good that it's changed because our scientific, understanding has changed. But that doesn't solve that doesn't answer the criticism, which is that you probably shouldn't have been recommending these things in the first place, right? Because when I was a kid, we grew up with the food, the square with the four quadrants, and then you got the pyramid. Um, and there's plenty of people out there who say like, oh well, no, actually the best thing is more protein and low carbohydrate, right?
Mm.
They don't like the carbs, they don't like the seed oils. But then you look at the base of the pyramid and it's like 8 to 11 servings of carbs. That's there should be like the foundation of the diet. And uh the question is, and there are of course all sorts of theories about well, food, very food industries like lobbied the FDA or the USDA um not to say, to present their products in a good light or not present them in a bad light. And that because ultimately it's a political decision, it's issued by the government. Ultimately, the agencies that are issuing this are headed by people who are presidential appointees, like you said. Um, they're sort of political creatures that there's maybe not a lot of reason to think they actually would be solid or would be based on some sort of objective analysis as opposed to influenced by all these other contributing like institutional and political factors.
Yeah, and we have real evidence of this happening. Richard Williams wrote his book "Fixing Food," and he worked for it was the Food and Drug Administration. I think it was the scientific department. He was a cost benefit analysis, and he mentions a few times throughout his book. And he was working, I think, the '80s through the early 2000s, or maybe a little bit earlier, maybe the '70s to the late '90s. And he said a few times that he would do a cost benefit analysis for a specific proposal. Like, let's say the FDA wants to regulate raw oysters because of there's like a flesh-eating bacteria you can get. Sorry if you like raw oysters, but the flesh-eating bacteria sometimes appears in raw oysters. And so Williams does this cost benefit analysis, says it actually won't do it. Like, what the regulation you're proposing is going to cost this much money, and it actually won't reduce the cases of this particular disease at all. And then he's asked to change that by someone above him, because someone above him wants to take ownership over, like, wants the FDA to take ownership over this, basically a turf war with the USDA or with another agencies. They want to get rules out there. So, and it is true, the industry lobbies heavily. And I mean, as you would too, if you had people with the power to basically like cut your neck off as an industry. But they also have lobbying from the think tank world and the charity class, the body parts organizations, American Heart Association, lung, like those get involved as well, or the Hypertensive Society, whatever. So there are a lot of push and pull. And like you said, if they are making these recommendations, especially when they're very specific, you kind of have to assume that has been influenced by something or other, and that it probably isn't based on very sound science. I mean, maybe not assume it's not based on sound science, but look into it.
Mm-hmm. So let's shift a bit and look at things that are currently legal, from things that are currently legal but highly regulated, like tobacco,
Hmm.
to things that were recently illegal, like marijuana. So we've had successful legalization and decriminalization drives in a number of states in recent years. So cannabis for medical and now even for recreational purposes is legal for use for millions of tens of millions of Americans in lots of states. What have we learned about that process of moving from, for forbidden substances to legal substances? Because we've sort of been looking at some of these things that are legal but highly regulated and said maybe there shouldn't be as many regulations on them. But when you're going in the other direction, do you want to go just barely legal but like really highly regulated, or is it better to just say no, just say it's legal and then let it rip?
I mean, it depends on what you want as a state in terms of, for me, public health, social justice, that kind of stuff. I think if you're taking something that was formerly illegal and was popular, right? So that's what a real prohibition is. It's prohibiting something that people actually want. There is going to be a pretty robust illicit market happening, right? We saw that with alcohol, we see with cannabis, we see with opioids, we see with basically everything that's prohibited. And if you're trying to legalize a market, right, one of the things you're going to do is give people the green light, be like, okay, this is now a socially sanctioned for adults or whatever activity. And some people who may be reticent to try will get involved. And then the other thing that's happening while you're legalizing is that you now have a new competition between the illicit market and the legal market. And the ability for the legal market to do anything, right, to attract consumers to pay taxes, to pay taxes that go to the services that deal with whatever repercussions of legalization happened. Those businesses need to make money, and to do that they have to be able, and we're seeing this in California, for example, where it hasn't been working so well since the beginning. They put a lot of California has a lot of regulations and a lot of taxes generally, so cannabis businesses that started up there had high costs, and because it's federally illegal, they're not allowed to deduct like normal business costs like every other business would be able to do. So they just were not able to compete on price in the market with the existing, what we call legacy operators, the dealers who have chosen not to exit the market now that it's legal. And there's just no competition. I think 70% of cannabis sales in California are still being done through the illicit market. And a few other states now that are talking about legalization are starting to wake up to this, that the regulations, like, we want to make sure we're protecting public health and we want to make sure we're getting our tax money, but we really need to be careful that we don't hobble these businesses so that they cannot compete with the illicit market. Because for one thing, you're not pushing out illicit markets. What you really want to do, and I honestly haven't seen any states do this well yet, what you want to do is kind of with policy, wrap your arms around as many of those people in the legacy market as you possibly can and bring them in, like, find a doorway, find a route for those people to enter into a legal arrangement with the state so that they're operating legally. And to do that, you need to make it really easy, right? Because that's one of the reasons people are on the streets dealing drugs, because they don't have to pay tax, they don't need a license, they don't have to go through all of these hoops. So you kind of need to make the hoops easier to jump through for people who are in the legacy market.
Well, yeah, it seems like the legalization movement, especially marijuana legalization, especially in the United States, has ended up being in sort of a political kind of like vice grips here, where PR wise, the easiest way to get people who are on the fence previously, who maybe weren't sure about whether marijuana should be legalized, to vote for it or to support it in general, is to say, well, don't worry, it'll be legal, but it'll be really highly regulated, and we'll really crack down on it, and we'll keep an eye on it really closely, so don't worry. And then that for some people that, are in the middle, weren't strongly supportive or, opposed to it, they'd be like, well, okay, well, that sounds safe. So now I can support it. But as you were pointing out, all of those like additional regulations that get promised during a, legalization movement are exactly the things that keep the black market alive, right? Because a lot of people, if you have the sort of very law-abiding middle-class sensibility, right, you wouldn't go out and buy illegal stuff. A lot of people, they're just, they like to play by the rules. And so, you wouldn't buy illegal, a stolen watch, would you? Of course not. But before legalization happens, 100% of the market is illegal by definition. So every single person who has a desire to purchase this product is already willing to break the law. So why would they be less willing to break the law when the penalties are dramatically lower if there's all this other cost and like bureaucracy in the way?
Yeah, and the other big lesson I think we've learned is that it really depends on timing, really matters, and how you legalize, like who gets into the market first. And it specifically matters in terms of politics, because if you allow certain entities, so with the broader cannabis legalization movement, they did a similar thing, trying to kind of stepwise the country into getting used to cannabis, saying like, we'll do medical first, it'll be tightly controlled. And everyone was like, oh, okay. And then what happened is eventually in a lot of these states, you had big medical corporations that do not want to let go of their monopoly, right? They don't want broader legalization to come in and pose new competition. And even if they're okay with recreational being legal in their state, they still want to make sure that they're not hobbled compared to now both the illicit market and the recreational market, right? Because if you're a cannabis patient and you're like, I'm going to go to my MedRx store and get my medical cannabis, and it's 20, 50, $100 more than what you get at a recreational legal store, why would you take your prescription? You're just going to do that. So it's the first modern example because we've seen it with alcohol. Well, we didn't see it, but we can read about it with alcohol in the aftermath. But watching the laboratories of democracy thing happen with cannabis and with gambling as well, the legalization of gambling, is really interesting to see states kind of fumble, like California a little, and then other states learn from that. And one of those is, like I mentioned, timing.
Well, yeah, and this is a that leads me to like the other thing I wanted to talk about with we've got the drinking, we got the smoking, we got all the fun stuff. But people also like to gamble, and I feel like there's it's not an exact symmetry there, but it's a, sort of roughly similar with over the same time that a lot of states have been implementing marijuana legalization or decriminalization. You also had sports gambling become legal, or at least it's possible for states to permit sports gambling in their own states the last 10 or 15 years or so. Um, how has that been evolving with because we've had at the same time we've had more lotteries, we've had more casinos be permitted in certain places in certain states, but then now we've got this big sports betting thing, and we've got DraftKings and FanDuel, and you can like bet from your phone. I was just I just walked past a bar that had like a FanDuel kiosk set up in the corner where they were like teaching people how to do sports bets, um, for something that was completely illegal for decades and now seems to be just kind of a casual everyday part of life. How has that process work in terms of like people who were so strongly against it to begin with?
There's still some growing pains. I think I still see people not quite used to the advertising for sports gambling. There's a lot of people I think have asked directly, like, yeah, sure, it shouldn't be illegal, but they don't necessarily want to know that it's going on while they're watching the game, which is weird because a lot of people gamble. It's their favorite part of the game. It really does. This is why casinos want to do it. It ups fan engagement when fans have money in the game, have like a real skin in the game in a way. But generally of the all the issues that I work on, I mean, and I'm not even exactly sure why this is, but as sports gambling in particular has kind of legislation for legalization has spread through the states, it's all been fairly decent. Like the political fights that you'd normally see with the entrenched interest trying to like stake their claim and one up the other, it wasn't happening too much. You have well, in certain states like California, you have a really politically strong entity like the Indian gaming casino interests. That's where and California still has not legalized sports betting, and that's one of the reasons why is because you have stronger interests that are politically strong in the state. But for the most part, you have the sports leagues will try every once in a while to force sports books to give them money. They'll call it something different, like an integrity fee. Like because there's gambling, we need more money to make sure our athletes aren't throwing games on purpose for gambling reasons. And you're like, well, they could have already been doing that since most sports gambling on American sports happens outside of America. But you should have been keeping, you should have been putting the money into that integrity already. But apart from that, most of the states are setting it up, and it seems like they're trying to make sure that they can license enough, that they have enough control and high enough taxes and all that, but they're not pushing people back into the illicit market for sports betting.
Yeah, I don't know if it's as obvious to everyone the advantages from moving from the black market to a legal market as it is with, say, like drugs.
Mhm.
Um, but again, I believe something you've written reminds me of this. The idea that the more sports gambling is on kind of reputable exchanges run by a like publicly listed gambling company that's subject to like rules and regulations, the easier it is to do things like spot cheating
Mhm.
or throwing games, right? Because if all the bets in the country are just being placed with like individual bookies, in the back of a bar, you can't do any data analysis on that, right? Because no one's keeping any records. But if all of it's being done by like a giant gambling company with $1 million database, it could be actually pretty easy to point out when there's some sort of anomaly where, people are betting on this one player no one's ever heard of, and then,
Mhm. And you really see, like, really one of the things that's happening too is that the illicit market itself is shrinking, right? So it's like the pool of water is draining away from the people who are trying to operate illicitly in that market. So it becomes harder for them to make a lot of money all at once, right? They would have to do smaller transactions. And yeah, if you're talking about integrity in terms of, like, bribing athletes or oh, I can't even think about it, referees, then yeah, if it's hard to judge just looking at gameplay and then legal market. But yeah, if you have the legal market, you can really correlate the data in terms of, like, specific players. Like, is this player's behavior really anomalous for the way that they would normally play? But yeah, having the data from the actual bets, like you said, if bets are suddenly swinging towards an underdog for no apparent reason, that's a big red flag. Then it becomes much easier to see when you can see the legal market versus whatever's happening in the illicit.
Yeah, and I guess these are all great topics. And looking forward, I wonder if, if we come back in a year or 5 years, is there going to be something that we're not talking about now that's going to be like the next big thing? Either, well, in either direction, really. Either something that is now currently not that controversial, but that is going to be getting, bans or more regulations on it, or something that's actually going to move in the other direction that's going to be moved towards legalization. I know many episodes ago, I talked to our old buddy Jacob Greer in Portland, Oregon, who writes a lot about this, and he's been fighting the battle that yes, adults should be allowed to use tobacco products, because we've now come to this situation where I feel like when I started working in like DC, where writing about public policy stuff, like 25 years ago, um, people used to joke, "Oh, wow, the way things are going these days, someday cigarettes will be illegal and marijuana will be legal." And then they said that as a joke, right? Like, wouldn't that be the craziest, most topsy-turvy thing you ever heard in your life? And like now we're getting kind of close to that, where
No,
a
we're
marijuana.
there. We are there. There was a bill in California, I think a year or two ago, where I mean, it might have been a city in California. They were like Los Angeles. They were trying to pass a bill that would disallow any smoking or tobacco products, including vaping, in public housing or in apartments. And but they had to exclude cannabis, any kind of use, including combustible. So everyone was like, "This makes so you can smoke a doobie in one apartment," and if the excuse is because the secondhand smoke goes through the vents or whatever, that's the excuse behind the legislation. Like, but then why would it be okay to smoke a cannabis doobie, like a burning cigarette, but not vape? And so the bill just failed because of the absurdity, but we're almost there.
Well, yeah, and in like New Zealand, they have the slow motion ban um on cigarettes where you have to be 18 to buy and then 21 and then eventually it keeps going up and up and up to only 80-year-olds will be able to smoke apparently.
I believe
um
they're done with that. They're not doing a generational ban, although you still have
oh,
like a
okay.
town in Massachusetts trying to do that, saying, if you're born after the year 2000 or whatever it is, then you can never smoke. It's absurd, especially under American law with equal protection stuff. You're like, I don't know.
So yeah, so we have, well, that's just an example of how the sort of like where we're standing at any given time can like really change dramatically as time goes on. And sort of like shifting opinions about negativity about anything connected to tobacco is just getting stronger over time. Yet you have, again, for you sort of mentioned like the sort of social justice reasons, is a significant part of why we have marijuana legalization, decriminalization in a lot of parts of the United States. That's for some people, that's like the most emotionally resonant reason to have decriminalization, legalization. Um, do you have any crystal ball recommendations, or you've got a bad feeling about this type issues where you see bad stuff is going to come in the future on whatever, whether it's nutrition or intoxicants or whatever, or do you see a good trend coming where you're like, well, this other stuff is good and seems to be trending in the right direction. Maybe topic X, topic Y, topic Z will be trend in the same direction as well.
Unfortunately, I think especially when it comes to like drugs harm reduction, that in that space, I think advocates are going to be having a harder fight than they're used to, and just that there's a growing amount of crime and punishment, law and order talk on a specific, but not limited to one side, but specifically, as we know, the crime bill, a lot of pretty overarching crime bills that were horrible for social justice were not only supported by one side or the other. But I've seen a big uptick in conversation negative towards things like needle exchange or opioid replacement therapy or just vapes versus cigarettes. I'm seeing a lot of people who would normally, you would think ideologically, would be on the side of let adults make their own choices. If people are going to do something risky, let's help them do it safer. Starting to back away from that a little bit, unfortunately. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see how that happens. I don't think, I mean, cannabis legalization is going to continue. I think it's going to stall out in a few states like it did in Oklahoma, unfortunately. It's got the nickname Toklahoma because it has so much medical cannabis, but the voters rejected a recreational bill or a recreational measure that was on the ballot last election. So we'll see. But I think, yeah, with things like alcohol and nutrition, I like that I'm seeing federal authorities, at least federal nutritional authorities, backing away from some stuff a little bit, or when they approach it, it's not quite so black and white and, hit the hammer, we've got to ban salt, or this thing causes cancer. It's a little more, they're stepping a little more on their toes, which I think is that would be a great thing for science if the people making recommendations were a little less certain of the things that they were saying, because we know they're not.
Yeah, and one more final topic, like in this general vein. I know Nick Gillespie would be mad at me if I didn't bring up the therapeutic use of psychedelics and LSD and MDMA, where some people are using it, you know, illegally now, of course, in microdosing. And the question is that therapeutic or recreational or a little bit of both? Some people, some of our big tech friends out in Silicon Valley claim that they have, it's like Ritalin. They think better, when they've got, a psychedelic microdose going on. But there's definitely, as plenty of advocates have been talking about, including people like Nick's written about it, there is really accumulating evidence that psychedelic therapy can help people with emotional trauma and long-term mental health issues. And if when I very first heard about that being the case, I thought, well, that's kind of sad because public health officials will never let that happen, no matter how persuasive the evidence becomes. But I think it's been several years that I've been reading more and more about different people writing about this and talking about. And again, with the sort of the social justice angle of legalizing marijuana, I think you need a sympathetic poster child for this. And I think combat veterans who are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, like that is an example of like who could possibly be more sympathetic, um, if that rather than a kid at a rave is the poster child for um, loosening up on psychedelic restrictions. Maybe that's a way forward. And again, that would be the, presumably the specific medical route rather than like, a wide scale recreational legalization. But that seems to me that maybe there's some optimism there.
There's a huge amount of, and there are already a few bills getting passed, in the states and being introduced in the states to do exactly that. And luckily, versus cannabis when medical first started, you had to prove you had a specific type of condition. The legislation that's being introduced now is much more like medical cannabis now, whereas you just need to get a physician's recommendation, and then you'll go in and you'll do a first dosing under supervision, and then after that you can get your product and take it home. This is a very promising area, and I hear the frustration in your voice, and I feel this frustration all the time when it comes to designating something as recreational versus medical, because this is just part of Western public health and medicine, is that it really likes to define what medicine is so that they can administer it. But it just is a true fact of human life that recreation and medicine are sometimes the same thing. That like what is therapeutic for an individual is kind of personal and individual. But I think the way that they're trying to do legalization with psychedelics now is bridging that gap of saying like, look, everyone knows that this will eventually be probably recreational, but we're going to make it really easy, even if it's only medical, for basically every adult who wants to get it, unless you don't have access to a doctor.
All right. Well, I'm cautiously optimistic now about the future of lifestyle freedom in general. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for being with us here. I'm glad I was finally able to get you here and Free the Economy. Before we go, where should people find you out there on the internet?
They can find me at reason.org. It's where I publish most of my stuff, or I'm on Twitter. I will not call it X, at Michelle Minton.
All right, fantastic. Go follow Michelle on X/Twitter immediately. Again, Michelle, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.